Okay, everybody, today we're going to look at monastic reform through the 12th century. I like to look at church history thematically as well as chronologically. And so we've just looked at the papacy from around 800 to around 1100. Today we're going to look at monasticism from about the same period of time. As we will see, papacy sometimes interacts with monasticism. Sometimes monasticism is an opponent of papacy. Sometimes it is a reformer. Sometimes the papacy uses monasticism as an outreach tool. And so we'll see a lot of interaction between these two great institutions of the medieval era. So let's see what transpires through these centuries and monasticism. Now, you'll recall that at the conclusion of the Charlemagne's reign, at his death, his empire was divided up and therefore weakened. There were invasions from the Norsemen to the north, the Hungarians from the east, as well as the Moors from the south. And so during these invasions, in a time of a weak empire, a weak central political structure, many of the monasteries were destroyed. And so monasticism felt a blow to its strength and vitality. The monasteries that survived, many of them became corrupt means for personal gain for the abbots, those who were in control. Remember, I told you that an abbot was supposed to be like a father to those under his care, and that an abbot was intended to take on the same physical responsibilities as others in the monastery. However, there's always room for corruption in a human institution. And so many of these abbots found themselves in a position where they were responsible for administering tremendous funds that came into the monastery. And many times they succumbed to greed and luxury to live lives of leisure while those under their care did the hard work of the monastery. So some abbots were willing to actually buy their posts. Sometimes they gained them through homicide. What a tragic thought. And then these abbots could live the easy life leading a monastery while others did the work. The Benedictine rule was ignored, and even those who sought out the monastery for a genuine call to the monastic life, they felt that their vocation was violated. So in the midst of the decline of monasticism in the 9th century, out of this came a tremendous movement of reform at the monastery of Cluny. So in 909, William of Aquitaine founded the monastery at Cluny. He used the land that he had dedicated to his hunting, and he built a monastery. He appointed Bernaud as the first abbot, and Bernaud was quite capable, and the following abbots over the next 2 centuries were high-minded abbots who sought to lead well. They were devoted to their task and serious about their Christian devotion. The greatest organizer of these Cluniac Reforms was Peter the Venerable. And these ideals were expanded throughout Europe as Cluny expanded through other daughter monasteries throughout the West. And so the Cluniac Reform spread as daughter monasteries brought these ideals to other regions beyond France, into other nations. Now, the Cluniac Reform had a number of ideals. First, they opposed simony, the practice of buying clerical posts. I've already mentioned that there were many abbots who bought their post, sought them through their wealth or their family's power, but the Cluniac Reform forbade that. They forbade clerical marriage. Again, they certainly wanted to maintain celibacy themselves, but even beyond, even into the church and the priesthood, they insisted that all clergy should not marry but abstain from sexual activity, not only for the fleshly purity that they saw in virginity and celibacy, but they wanted to prevent the idea of clerical positions becoming inherited. They promoted obedience. The monks were to be obedient to their superiors. They were to be obedient to the Benedictine rule. But get this, they also insisted that the church should be obedient to the Pope. Now, remember, this is the 900s. Do you remember what's going on in the papacy in the period of 904 to 962? Do you remember what we called this debauched period of the papacy? Yes, it's the pornocracy. And yet it is at this time that the Cluniac Reform is developing, and the Cluniac Reform is saying that the church should be obedient to the papacy, even during a time when the papacy is at its most corrupt. Well, the hope and intention is that someday out of the Cluniac Reform would come a great papal leader who would head a great renewal in the church. And this is exactly what will happen in the next century. Do you remember Leo the Ninth, who brought about the reform known as the Gregorian Reform? Leo the Ninth came out of the Cluniac Monastic Reform, and he was the Pope that led the great renewal that the Cluniacs had hoped for. There was a centralized organization, one abbey with a number of branch houses, and through these branch houses they spread their Cluniac ideals. Now, one monastic principle that was ambivalent was the issue of poverty. Indeed, a monk should own nothing and should observe his vow of poverty, but a Cluniac monastery could own vast properties and wealth. All right, why would this happen? Well, obviously, nobility were giving the land for the monasteries, so vast properties. These properties, through agriculture, livestock, and other material forms of wealth, could bring tremendous income to the monastery. Besides this, the nobility often gave donations to the monasteries in hopes that they would pray for them and for their descendants, praying them out of purgatory. And so there are many donations given to monasteries in hopes of receiving intercessory prayer. In the system of inheritance that was prevalent during this time frame, the property of the family would go only to the eldest son. What about other sons? What about daughters? Well, the sons could go into the military, but often they went into the church. They might go into the priesthood seeking a bishop or archbishop's position. or they could go into a monastery. If a son went into the monastery, then the family would donate property and wealth to the monastery to help support their son or their daughter. Many times, a daughter would go into a monastery and become an abbess. Her only other option was marriage. All right, so all this to say that monasteries could be retainers of tremendous wealth and property, and the abbot of a monastery, could have the opportunity to gain personal prestige and luxury through his position. So eventually, Cluniac monks were able to evade the simple life and live a life of luxury. And at this point, the wealth of monasteries invited simony, so that people began to buy those positions. So the reform turned itself upside down and fell into the very corruption and abuse that they had sought to avoid. Isn't that the way with human institutions? Many of them start out well and then decline. But at that time, a new reform takes its place, and certainly that is the case with monasticism. Other reform movements developed to take the place of the Cluniac Reform. One such movement was the Cistercian Movement. 1098, almost 200 years after the founding of Cluny, Robert of Moulins founded a monastery at Citeaux. The Latin name for this town was Cistercium, and so the movement took its name from the Latin, and so we call it the Cistercian Movement. They vowed a return to Benedictine simplicity. They had plain facilities. They had a strict diet. They practiced manual labor, and then they utilized agriculture as means of support. Now, the best known of the Cistercian monks was Bernard, who is abbot of the monastery at Clairvaux. You see his life dates there. Largely, he was a 12th century figure gifted in meditation and preaching. He was a champion of ecclesiastical reform. He influenced popes, particularly Pope Eugenius III. There was a debate over Eugenius's election, but Bernard turned the debate into the favor of Eugenius, who was his protege. He was an enemy of theological innovation, as we will see. Anyone who tried to introduce new theology found in Bernard an opponent. He was the preacher of the Second Crusade. All right, we'll talk about the Crusades next, but we'll see that when it came time for a renewed crusade, Bernard is the one who advocated the crusade with his tremendous preaching. He was such a good preacher and recruiter for the monastery at Clairvaux and other monasteries in the Cistercian movement. It's said that when he came into a town, the women said, "Hide your men, Bernard is here." And Bernard would recruit the sons, the brothers, even the husbands into the monastery. He was so eloquent in his preaching. But it wasn't just his preaching, it was also his hymn writing that was remarkable. And there are at least 2 hymns that are still sung today, at least in churches where they sing hymns. But beautiful lines in the hymn, "O Sacred Head, now wounded, with grief and shame weighed down, now scornfully surrounded with thorns, thine only crown. How pale thou art with anguish, with sore abuse and scorn! How does that visage languish, which once was bright as morn? Often I am asked about the spiritual life of the medieval Christians when we focus on popes and abbots who seem to function in corrupt and abusive ways. Where is the sense of wonder? Where is the sense of spiritual devotion to Christ? Well, I think we see it here in this hymn and the next one. When Bernard sings, Jesus, the very thought of thee with sweetness fills the breast, but sweeter far thy face to see, and in thy presence rest. Both of these hymns are sung by a number of artists and are available on YouTube. I encourage you to seek them out. I certainly am not going to attempt to sing them for you because that would not be very uplifting. All right, but these are beautiful hymns, and there are beautiful renditions available. So the Cistercian movement, as I said, sought to reform the monastic movement, beyond that to reform the church. And I want to point out that Bernard is another example of a monastic who does not remain cloistered, but he went out and about preaching, recruiting, calling for reform, calling for the crusade. He was influential in the church. And so we need not think of the monastics as being cloistered and isolated from the church. No, there were many who were out and about in their communities and in the church at large. All right, other orders that developed during this time period include the Carthusians. All right, this was a harshly ascetic order, and even though they lived communally, gathered together in a community, the individuals lived in cells and practiced hermetic monasticism as well. You've heard of the vow of silence. The Carthusians observed that. They were committed to scholarship, and they were active in keeping scripts, transcribing the Bible, transcribing Christian writings, and even classical writings. All right, the Carmelites were founded in connection with the Crusades on Mount Carmel. I have been to Israel several times, and often we will ascend Mount Carmel, where Elijah slew the prophets of Baal, and there is a monastery at the very top that was founded by the Carmelites. They engaged in spiritual warfare through prayer and devotion. We'll hear more about the Carmelites in the second half of Christian history, when the Catholic Church reforms through the efforts of Teresa of Avila, who ignites the Carmelite order. Then there's also the Augustinians, founded a little bit later, but they observe the rule of St. Augustine, which is again a more studious, less ascetic rule. And it is the Augustinian order that attracts Martin Luther. So Martin Luther comes out of this very order, founded in 1256 in Italy, obviously also active in Germany. All right, there are two orders, monastic orders of the Crusades. The Knights Hospitallers, they provided hospitality and care for sick among the pilgrims and crusaders in the Holy Land. And then the Knights Templar, founded in 1128, they provided protection to pilgrims and crusaders. They fought in the Crusades. They later transported ecclesiastical funds and established banking houses. I will have much more to say about these two monastic crusading orders when we talk about the Crusades in our next lecture. Now let's just ask the question, What was the attraction of monasticism? Why is it that someone would leave a normal home life out in the community? Why would they reject marriage and activity in order to retreat to a monastery? Well, one thing was there was the belief in the meritoriousness of monastic labor, devotion, and asceticism. There was a genuine belief during the medieval era that one certain way to get to heaven, minimizing one's time in purgatory, was to dedicate oneself to the celibate life, the ascetic life, the devoted life of the monastic. There's a reason why Martin Luther, when threatened with death, offered to become a monk in order to save his life. He believed in the meritoriousness of monastic labor. All right, there was encouragement from popes. Popes were independent of secular and controlled by the bishops, and so often monasticism was a tool or an ally of the papacy. There's a disordered situation in Europe. There's threats of invasion, as I said at the outset, and some felt that they could be more secure in a cloistered community with others. There would be food and shelter provided in the monastery. There's a desire for education, and remember, the monastery is one of the very few sources of education during the medieval era. And then, as I said, great monastic preachers became proselyting vehicles like Bernard, who would go from city to city recruiting volunteers for the monastic life. There are a number of benefits to civilization from monasticism. Monks became adept at copying the Bible and other books. And we can thank monasticism for preserving copies of the Bible, Christian literature, ancient classical literature as well. Monastic houses became teaching centers, hospitals, pharmacies, and hotels. Many of the monks would study herbs and health care, and so you would go to the monastery seeking wisdom for healing, for herbs and medicines. If you were traveling and you wanted a protection at night, you would seek the nearest monastery. So the monasteries became very helpful to their community as a whole. Monasteries preserved the culture of the past through their transcription of records and treatises. Monasteries provided the only source of education. Later, they're going to provide the educators for the universities. We'll see the rise of universities, and those professors will come out of monasticism. Monks, especially the Cistercians, would cultivate unused land and make it productive. The Cistercians received lands from the nobles, but often the nobles would give them heavily wooded lands, and they'd have to chop down the trees to create land that could be cultivated. They might donate a desert that they'd have to irrigate, or a swamp that they would have to draw the water out of, and so they could cultivate land that was unused and make it productive. All right, so this was another way that monks were productive in their communities. And then monasticism allowed opportunities for women to serve the church and to lead. Typically, women were expected to marry and to contribute it through their family life and their offspring. But if a woman desired to be a leader in the church, to be a religious leader, then a monastery was a place where this could happen. Hildegard von Bingen is an example of a woman who became an abbess and became a religious leader, winning even the approval of Bernard of Clairvaux as she went about preaching. Okay, she was criticized often for preaching, but she said, if the men would preach as they're supposed to, then I wouldn't have to. All right, but she saw a need and she filled it. All right, so opportunities for women to lead through the female monasteries. Now, there were evils of monasticism. Often monasteries would discredit the Christian life through lives of wealth and ease, through great immorality and debauched lifestyles, and light penance was given for grave sins. So many of those on the outside looked at monasticism as living an easy life. They drained Europe of productive land, wealth, and population as more people went into monasteries, as more land was given to monasteries. Then monasticism took that away from public life. It undercut married life with its demand for celibacy, became an abused tool of the papacy. And ultimately, when the Reformation spread through Europe, the Reformed territories closed down the monasteries, and the monastic lands then were confiscated by the territorial leadership. And so we do not see monasticism going forward in the Reformation era, all right? But during the medieval era, still it's very dominant, and it has pros and cons, all right? And so we need to see both, all right? We may not appreciate monasticism. We may think of them as being isolated from the world and not participating in the broader civilization and taking the word, but that really is not true. As you've seen, many of the missionaries came out of the monastic movement. The monastery still had influence over the broader life of the church. All right, so pros and cons, keep them balanced. All right, and so we'll continue to talk about the papacy and monasticism as we pursue our study of the medieval era of the church. So stay tuned and see what happens next. Okay, bye for now.